starting to become more widespread in games and now has things like direct hardware support in the latest versions of AMD cards. They call it partially resident textures. Another important advancement, I think, is pText. And pText is actually a texturing format that's open sourced that was originally developed at Disney Studios. They developed it as they were making the film Bolt. And the idea was, in their art pipeline, their artists would originally start with a model and then they'd have to bake texture or lay out UV texture coordinates for everything before they could start painting. And what pText does is it allows artists to work with subdivision surfaces, which are pretty much the standard in the modeling industry now, start painting straight away directly on top of the model. Every face in the model essentially has its own unique texture. And then the secret is to be able to blend seamlessly between textures on those faces. And also to paint in different areas, different resolutions. So I can go right into the eyebrow and paint really high detail resolution there, where it might actually be needed. And that's very important as well when you're modeling characters, because we tend to focus in different places to different degrees. So it's important to model things around the eyes with a huge amount of fidelity and lower fidelity perhaps in other places. So pText also is starting to be used in games. So not only do artists use it to mock up the original model, but then they can do their UV layout at the end of the process instead of at the start of the process and get it exactly right. Apart from modeling then, I think animation technology advances are starting to move forward in games. We're at a stage now where you can go to a motion capture studio and capture a performance. You can capture facial performance and you can capture body movement pretty well, and you can play that back in a cutscene in a game with a reasonable amount of accuracy. But I think when you go, it's always clear in a game when it moves from a cutscene to actual gameplay. Strangely, immediately you spot the movement isn't realistic. And there's a number of reasons for that, not just technological reasons, but also there's this constant battle between animation fidelity and responsiveness. If I go to run from a standing position, it might take me a full second to wind up and lean forward into the run and then start to run. But maybe that's not what the game designer wants. Maybe they want that to be more responsive straight away. You'll often see things like people can run instantly from a standing stop in the game. And momentum is rarely carried through as the character moves in one direction and suddenly changes direction again. But people are starting to do research in these areas. I still think things like animation blending is really underused in an awful lot of interactive situations. And technologies that are available from Havok and from Crytek that use animation blending are starting to get an awful lot of value just from basic blending. But there's other more complicated areas of research which take motion databases and then try and synthesize motion on the fly as user inputs change. And we'll see a couple of examples in the next video. Let's try. Do you want to try clicking and see if we get some magic this time? No? Okay. If you switch back out to the folders. And it should be called animation montage. So here we see some just raw animation blending, and the inputs to this animation are actually coming from the vehicle itself. So depending on the speed and the orientation of the car, it's deciding what animation should be blended for the character that's on the hood. And then at the very end, when it gets close, it cuts into an actual cutscene where he grabs on and then boards the plane without a boarding pass. In the next section, this is the motion field research I talked about, where it's looking at a database of actual animations. The arrow represents the desired orientation for the character, and it tries to adapt in real time to those changes, abrupt changes. It comes up with a pretty plausible solution. Okay, let's switch back. That's okay. Now, I still think even with this repertoire of basic motions that we can do, a fully dynamic interactive character is still a completely open and unsolved problem for us. And we're going to see a lot more research in this area as time progresses. The last technical area I think that's important is context sensitivity. What I mean by that is most of our animations are either authored in quite a sterile environment, either on a flat plane, or motion captured in a motion capture studio. Taking that and then adapting it for different conditions, putting it in context, is what really roots the character in the scene. And it can be very complicated things like trying to work out balance, or simple things like when I'm standing on uneven terrain that maybe I shift my weight slightly to the left. In this example here, in the screenshot from Avatar, you can see that Navi's braids are draped over her neck, and that's because of the actual orientation of her head with respect to the rest of her body. None of that is actually animated, that's simulated in real time. Simulating subtle details like clothing and like skin and muscle actually add an awful lot to the plausibility of the scene. If we just go back to the videos, there's another video there I'd like you to launch. In this video, it's just simulation on top of hand animated data. It's called Have a Cloth, and it might get you to shut it off a little early. If you just fast forward a little bit on this. Perfect. Perfect. So all the troll's clothing and his belly and the feathers on his head, they're all being simulated in real time. And it roots him in the scene. You can see things like his motion as he rolls forward, as he roars, when the cape flies up over his back. It just adds to that performance. Very difficult to animate, relatively straightforward to actually simulate. So they're the three technical areas I think are going to drive us towards more cinematic characters. But if we look as well, in terms of creating cinematic gameplay, we've also got advances in rendering that are going to be important. When we look at movies, the vast majority of things tend to be rendered through ray tracing. That simply requires far too much processing power to be viable on today's types of machines in real time. And rasterization is going to be the rendering paradigm of choice for the foreseeable future. We're seeing elements of ray tracing leak into rasterized graphics, so things like ambient occlusion and techniques like parallax occlusion mapping are starting to add to the realism of, but we tend to still build scenes in games differently than we do in movies. So instead of rendering out a single frame, we build things up in layers, a little like the compositing we saw earlier. So here's an example where geometry is overlaid with diffuse textures. Here's some sort of shading. We add sunlight in, add shadows in, put in some particle effects, add in some screen space effects like more fog, and then add in color grading, which is an actual film technique that's used. And you end up with the final scene built up from these different effects. If we just take a look again at a slightly different scene. Diffuse textures, old PS2 game. Some shading, sunlight, shadows. Finally, the color grading to build the final effect. I think it's worth pointing out one piece of technology that's going to become more mainstream, and it's tessellation technology, in particular this DirectX 11 tessellation technology, where you take the black and white image on the left and use it with the triangles you have to create geometry on the GPU on the fly. This is a nice side effect. It's very efficient in terms of memory bandwidth, but also it scales well across a whole range of devices. So you can either choose the resolution you want to divide down to, so instant LOD if you will, or choose not to use this at all if it's a very low-end device like a mobile device. It's interesting now that we kind of have some things where GPU power is so powerful that we can do them, and particularly can only do them on GPU. So for instance, if I try to simulate an ocean on the CPU and send 30 kilometers of ocean wave data across the GPU to be rendered every frame, it's simply not feasible. But it's relatively straightforward to go and try and render the ocean directly and do the compute on the GPU and the rendering on the GPU, which leads to some very nice, interesting scenes, and it's great, but can also be a nightmare, particularly for if we're trying to do, for instance, work out the height of a boat or do some physical simulation based on that. Taking the results back from the GPU can sometimes be complicated. But dynamic tessellation technology, I think, is one of those areas where it's an incremental improvement on techniques that we have today, and we're going to see it more widespread and more used throughout games. The last place I want to look at is cinematic environments and large-scale destruction in cinematic environments. So here's, the movie played. How interesting. Here's an example of some large-scale destruction from movies. And it's pretty dramatic, but I thought it might be useful to have a look at how we do these sort of things a long time ago. So this is a scene from Bridge over the River Kwai, if anyone remembers that, 1957. Before CGI, to actually make this took 8 months. The bridge is 425 feet and 50 feet above the water. It took 500 workers, 35 elephants, and about $3 million to produce this final effect. We got one take. If we have a look at what's actually possible today, maybe you can click in the middle. This one might work if the others did. No? Okay. Let's go back out. Take 2. And it should be final merged. Yes. So this is what we do on a high-end PC today, and this is a simulation we put together. It's supposed to emulate that type of scene where we're trying to show how you can have cinematic moments in gameplay, and this is all done in real time. You'll have to add your own sound effects. I'll just wrap up there, Scott, and say that these things actually, when we bring them all together, they actually give us this more cinematic gameplay experience, which is great for games, and games has learned an awful lot from movies. But I think what's going to happen as well in the future is we're going to see a lot more crossover between simulation and games too, because some of the things that simulation finds particularly important are becoming very important for games as well. Things like the scale of the worlds we live in. Even the largest games today have a scale of about 20 miles if they're real-time interactive games. And the Jet will cross that at Mach 2.5 in less than 5 minutes. Not very good for a simulation. Also, things like measurability that are very important in simulation are starting to become very important in games, purely to monetize and work out what players are actually doing. But that's an area where an awful lot of people can actually learn things from the simulation industry, and they're starting to cross over into games. Okay, thanks for your attention. Are there any questions? That's correct. We were acquired by Intel in 2007. Today, we apply our physics on a broad range of platforms, and it's predominantly a CPU-based solution. So we're not trying to bring it and code it into hardware today. And one of the reasons for that is because people like to take our solutions and adapt them and change them for each of the different cases that they actually have. So I don't think we're going to see, we've seen failed attempts at this, I don't think we're going to see pure hardware-based solutions anytime soon in physics. Thank you.
Impact of design technology and technology on serious games in the past and the future. Doug Whately is CEO and founder of Breakaway Games. He's had 25 years of successful game building experience.
You can say it any way you want, game building or gaming. I am from Breakaway, and we have been doing games, both entertainment and serious games, for almost 15 years now.